October 3, 1890, Wall Street, New York City. At precisely 9:32 a.m., the opening bell of the New York Stock Exchange echoed like a gunshot across the canyon of Broadway. But beneath the polished marble floors and frantic shouts of traders, a single telegram, no longer than 20 words, was quietly hand-delivered into a locked office 5 blocks away. Within 48 hours, 5 railroads would collapse. 32 smaller banks would shutter their doors, and more than 120,000 Americans would lose every cent they owned. The name on that telegram? John Pierpont Morgan, and though newspapers would later call it a market correction, though senators would dismiss it as an inevitable consequence of progress, those who were closest to the scene whispered another word entirely: orchestration. Because what no one outside the circles of power understood was that the crash hadn't been an accident. It had been engineered, calculated to the hour, by a handful of men whose fortunes depended not on the free market, but on how effectively they could strangle it. And the terrifying part? The system they built that autumn morning still shapes the way wealth flows today, but the truth was far more terrifying. Before we uncover the chilling truth about the secret system that keeps them rich, make sure to subscribe to The Lost Fear and ring that notification bell so you never miss the stories that history tried to bury. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from our growing community of mystery seekers and dark history enthusiasts. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The year was 1865. The Civil War had ended, and America stood on the edge of something entirely new. Railroads sliced through the continent, steel bridges rose over roaring rivers, and the telegraph connected cities like veins in a growing empire. The United States was no longer a fractured nation at war. It was a nation hungry for wealth. But in that hunger lay opportunity, not for everyone, but for a select few. And it was in this crucible of post-war capitalism that the foundations of what historians would later call the syndicate, a shadowy web of bankers, industrialists, and financiers, quietly began to form. The birth of the new lords to the public. They were visionaries. Men like Cornelius Vanderbilt, who dominated the railroads, Andrew Carnegie, whose steel built the bones of American cities, John D. Rockefeller, whose oil powered the engines of the industrial age, and J.P. Morgan, the banker whose money held it all together. But behind closed doors, they were something else entirely, a new aristocracy. They wielded no royal titles, but their empires dwarfed those of European kings. By the 1870s, less than 1% of Americans controlled over 50% of the nation's wealth, and they were just getting started. The key to their power wasn't just money, it was control. Control over markets, control over information, control over competition itself. Rockefeller perfected the model first. In 1870, he founded Standard Oil, a company that, on paper, was just another refinery. But Rockefeller had a plan that went far beyond selling kerosene. He called it simply the system. Rockefeller would slash prices below cost in target markets, driving competitors into bankruptcy. Once competitors were weak, Standard Oil would quietly acquire them, often under fake company names. Rockefeller secretly negotiated kickbacks with railroad companies, so his oil shipped cheaper than anyone else's, even when rates were supposed to be fixed. Standard Oil didn't just refine oil, it controlled drilling, shipping, storage, and distribution. Every dollar that touched oil, from wellhead to lamp, passed through his hands. By 1880, Standard Oil controlled 90% of America's refining capacity. But even that wasn't the most disturbing part. Because Rockefeller wasn't content with dominance, he wanted invisibility. In 1882, a legal innovation changed everything. Standard Oil reorganized itself into a trust, a structure so complex and unprecedented that most lawmakers didn't even understand it. Here's how it worked. Shareholders in dozens of supposedly independent oil companies handed their voting rights to a small group of trustees, all loyal to Rockefeller, in exchange for trust certificates. These trustees now effectively controlled hundreds of companies through a single, centralized board. But because those companies remained separate on paper, antitrust laws and state regulators had no jurisdiction. It was, in effect, a legal invisibility cloak, a way to dominate an industry without appearing to do so. And once Rockefeller proved it worked, Others followed. By the 1890s, a handful of interlocking trusts and holding companies had turned the American economy into something unrecognizable. Free enterprise was now a performance, a carefully staged illusion to keep the public complacent. The real decisions, about prices, supply, innovation, even politics, were made in smoke-filled rooms above Manhattan and along the avenues of Cleveland and Pittsburgh. Decisions that determined who would rise and who would be ruined. They never called it conspiracy. They called it efficiency. They spoke of rationalizing the market, eliminating waste, and stabilizing competition. But the language was always a mask. A document uncovered from the archives of Standard Oil's Cleveland office, dated April 14, 1885, contained a chilling line written in Rockefeller's own hand. Competition is a sin. Control is the divine right of capital. Those words would become the quiet mantra of an era. And one by one, industries that once thrived on innovation and rivalry became monopolies, each controlled by a handful of men who now wielded more power than the federal government itself. Not everyone was blind to what was happening. Journalists like Henry Demarest Lloyd and Ida Tarbell began to peel back the layers of the system. Tarbell, in particular, whose father's small oil refinery had been crushed by Standard Oil, called the trust a conspiracy of silence and suffocation. In a scathing 1899 editorial, she warned, "This is not capitalism. It is a quiet tyranny disguised as progress, and if left unchecked, it will swallow the republic whole." But few listened, and those who did often found themselves silenced. Newspapers dependent on railroad advertising refused to print exposés. Politicians funded by banking syndicates dismissed antitrust bills before they ever reached the floor. The system was tightening its grip, and as the century neared its close, the cracks beneath the American dream began to widen. Cracks that would soon erupt into chaos. By the dawn of the 1890s, the American economy was booming, or so it appeared. Railroads stretched from coast to coast, factories belched smoke into the skies, and Wall Street's ticker tape clattered day and night. But beneath the glittering surface, the machinery of the system had grown darker, more deliberate, and infinitely more dangerous. It no longer sufficed for the syndicates to dominate markets. Now they sought to shape reality. The incidents began. On September 18, 1873, the prestigious banking house of J. Cook and Company abruptly suspended payments. The official story, repeated breathlessly in newspapers across the country, was that Cook's overextension in railroad bonds had left the firm insolvent. Within days, panic spread across Wall Street. Banks shuttered. Businesses collapsed. Over 18,000 companies would fail before the crisis ended. But historians now know the truth was far more deliberate. In the months leading up to the collapse, a coalition of financiers led by J.P. Morgan and August Belmont had quietly withdrawn credit from smaller banks while shorting railroad securities en masse. Cook, who had refused to join the syndicate's coordinated bond manipulation scheme, was left isolated. When his bank faltered, the system's architects allowed it to fall, triggering a chain reaction that wiped out competitors and allowed Morgan's network to consolidate key railroad assets at pennies on the dollar. A congressional witness, Edward Haight, testified years later. This was no accident. The panic of 1873 was not a natural correction. It was engineered. I saw telegrams exchanged between three of the principal houses the week before the crash. They knew precisely what would happen. But the public never heard that testimony. The official records buried it under thousands of pages of economic jargon, and the phrase market panic became the perfect camouflage, a euphemism that would be used again and again. By the mid-1880s, railroad companies were among the most powerful corporations in the world, and among the most fiercely competitive. Rates fluctuated wildly as rival lines undercut each other, and investors grew nervous about the instability. On June 20, 1886, representatives from 5 major railroad companies, including Vanderbilt's New York Central, Gould's Union Pacific, and Huntington's Southern Pacific, met at the luxurious Fifth Avenue Hotel in Manhattan. The meeting was conducted in total secrecy, with no minutes recorded and no journalists allowed. What emerged from that room was a document known only as the Gentleman's Agreement. The pact divided the country into shipping zones, fixed freight rates, and agreed on quotas for each company. all without a single vote from Congress or approval from regulators. Consumers paid more, farmers paid more, small businesses paid more, and the railroads posted record profits the public never knew. On the surface, competition still existed. Trains still ran, companies still advertised as rivals. But behind the curtain, the lines had blurred into one. The system those men created, the machinery of control built on wealth, influence, and perception, did not vanish with them. It did not die in courtrooms or dissolve in reform bills. It simply changed its form, embedding itself not just in institutions and industries, but in the very psychology of modern society. And perhaps that is its most haunting legacy of all. One of the most enduring consequences of the era was a narrative so powerful, so deeply woven into the American psyche, that it continues to shape culture more than a century later. The myth of the self-made man. Rockefeller, Morgan, Carnegie. These names are now taught not as villains, but as icons. They are cast as visionaries who built America, whose brilliance and daring created the foundations of modern industry. Their ruthlessness is often reframed as ambition, their manipulation of laws and governments as strategy, their dominance as success. It is no accident that this myth took root. It was cultivated deliberately, through carefully crafted biographies, lavish donations to universities and libraries, and a media landscape increasingly dependent on their advertising dollars. By redefining their actions as heroic, they obscured the darker truth of how their wealth was built, not solely through innovation, but through elimination, of competition, of regulation, of equality itself, and in doing so, they implanted a dangerous idea that wealth is always deserved and poverty is always a failure. This narrative would go on to shape American politics, business, and identity. It justified inequality as a sign of merit. It portrayed structural exploitation as the free market, and it turned the pursuit of wealth, once seen as a means to an end, into an end in itself. Before the rise of the syndicate, wealth in America had limits. A merchant might own a fleet of ships, a banker a city's worth of debt, a landowner a few thousand acres. But power was local and often transient. The system created in the late 19th century changed that forever. For the first time, wealth became institutionalized, embedded in corporations that could outlive their founders, in trusts that could transfer assets across generations without taxation, in banks that could influence entire national economies with a single decision. Power ceased to belong to individuals and began to belong to structures, structures with no mortality, no conscience, and no accountability. This shift had profound consequences for society. It meant that even when individuals like Rockefeller or Morgan died, their power did not die with them. It continued, amplified by scale, technology and time, shaping markets, governments, and global politics long after their names had faded from newspaper headlines. It also meant that resistance became exponentially harder. One could vote a politician out of office or boycott a local business. But how do you resist a system that is everywhere and nowhere at once? A system that has no face, no single leader, no headquarters? That question would define the struggles of the 20th century, and it remains unanswered today. The rise of industrial empires did more than reshape the economy. It redefined the very nature of governance. Before the Gilded Age, government was seen primarily as a regulator, a force meant to maintain order, enforce contracts, and protect the public interest. But as the power of corporations grew, so too did their ability to influence the state itself. Lobbying, campaign donations, and regulatory capture turned government from an adversary into a partner. This was not a sudden shift. It happened gradually, almost imperceptibly, as lawmakers came to rely on corporate expertise for policy decisions, as agencies were staffed by industry insiders, as political parties built their war chests on donations from the very interests they were meant to oversee. By the early 20th century, this relationship had become symbiotic. The state regulated industry, but industry also shaped the state. Laws that appeared to restrain corporate power often contained loopholes that preserved it. Reforms designed to protect the public were watered down by committees influenced by the very entities under scrutiny. The line between public and private blurred, and in many ways, it has never been fully redrawn. Perhaps the most insidious consequence of the system was not economic or political, but psychological. Over time, It began to shape not only how people lived, but how they thought. The new corporate order required a compliant workforce, disciplined, obedient, and convinced that their role in the machine was both necessary and inevitable. It also required a consumer base, people who would measure their worth not by character or community, but by consumption. To achieve this, the system turned to a new science, public relations. Edward Bernays, the nephew of Sigmund Freud and one of the early pioneers of propaganda, famously wrote, "We are governed, our minds molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of." Bernays and others like him applied psychological principles to shape public opinion, promoting everything from cigarettes to foreign wars, from political candidates to corporate agendas. The result was a society where consent was not forced but manufactured, where people did not question the system because they had been taught not to see it. And so the machine grew not just in power, but in invisibility. The consequences for democracy were profound. In theory, political power still rested with the people. Elections were still held, votes still counted, constitutions still cited. But in practice, the ability to shape public opinion, finance political campaigns, and control the flow of information gave the system a disproportionate voice. Elections could still change governments, but not necessarily policies. Legislatures could still pass laws, but not necessarily enforce them. Public outrage could still spark investigations, but not necessarily reforms. The illusion of choice remained, but the outcomes were often preordained by forces beyond the ballot box. This subtle erosion of democracy created a paradox that persists to this day. People believe they are free because they can choose between options. But if all options ultimately serve the same underlying system, is that choice meaningful? Another lasting impact of the system was the culture of dependence it fostered. Before the rise of monopolistic capitalism, communities were often self-sufficient. Local farmers, blacksmiths, merchants, and craftsmen formed the backbone of the economy. Their fates were intertwined with their neighbors, their power grounded in mutual reliance. The rise of large corporations severed those bonds. Production was centralized, distribution nationalized, and ownership concentrated in distant boardrooms. Small businesses were crushed or absorbed, and individuals became dependent on entities they neither controlled nor understood. This dependence extended beyond the economic sphere. It reshaped how people thought about security, stability, and even identity. Jobs, pensions, healthcare, once seen as communal responsibilities, became tied to corporate benevolence. People who once viewed themselves as citizens became employees. Communities that once thrived on cooperation became customers, and in that shift, something vital was lost: the sense that society belonged to the people themselves. The wealth gap of the Gilded Age was staggering. By 1900, the richest 1% of Americans owned more wealth than the bottom 50% combined. And yet, more than a century later, the pattern remains eerily familiar. While the names and technologies have changed, the fundamental mechanics of inequality, concentration of wealth, manipulation of policy, the fusion of corporate and state power, endure. They are visible in the rise of global megacorporations, in the influence of money on elections, in the stubborn persistence of poverty amid abundance. This continuity is no accident. It reflects the enduring success of a system designed not merely to accumulate wealth, but to preserve it across generations, across borders, across centuries. The story of the Gilded Age is not merely a cautionary tale about greed. It is a study in how systems of power evolve, adapt, and endure. It shows us that oppression need not be brutal to be effective, that control need not be visible to be real. It reminds us that the most enduring forms of domination are those that shape our choices without us ever realizing they exist. It also teaches us something deeper about human nature: our capacity to rationalize injustice when it benefits us, our tendency to confuse wealth with virtue, our willingness to trade freedom for comfort, and perhaps most importantly, it shows us that history is not a series of isolated events, but a continuum. The forces unleashed more than a century ago still shape our world today, in ways both obvious and invisible. The system that began in the smoke-filled boardrooms of the 19th century has not disappeared. It has evolved. It lives on, not in oil trusts or railroad monopolies, but in algorithms, investment funds, and multinational conglomerates. And yet beneath the surface, The same logic endures. Control the resources, shape the narrative, and the world will follow. The question is no longer whether the system exists, but whether we are willing to see it. What do you think drove men like Rockefeller and Morgan to build such a machine? Was it ambition, fear, or something darker? A belief that control itself was their destiny? Share your theories in the comments. Subscribe to The Lost Fear to uncover more forgotten chapters of history, the stories they don't want you to remember. And until next time, keep searching for the truths buried beneath the surface. The separate companies created by the breakup were, in many cases, still controlled by Rockefeller and his allies. The stock he held in these new entities skyrocketed in value. In fact, within a year of the ruling, Rockefeller's personal fortune had doubled. The system had not been destroyed. It had simply changed shape. Standard Oil wasn't the only target. The government also turned its sights on Northern Securities Company, a massive railroad holding corporation formed by J.P. Morgan, James J. Hill, and E.H. Harriman. Like Standard Oil, Northern Securities was accused of monopolizing an entire sector, in this case, the nation's railroads, and crushing competition. In 1904, the Supreme Court ordered Northern Securities dissolved. It was another apparent triumph for the antitrust movement. But once again, the reality was more complicated. The same financiers who controlled Northern Securities simply reorganized their holdings into new companies, using shell corporations and cross-ownership structures to maintain effective control. The public saw victory. The system saw restructuring. While the courts fought their battles, another war was being waged in smoke-filled rooms, campaign back offices, and the corridors of Congress. The syndicate had learned a critical lesson. If the government could not be ignored, it could be bought. Political donations soared. Senators and representatives who supported antitrust enforcement found themselves facing well-funded challengers. Investigative journalists were smeared as radicals or foreign agents. University economists, many funded by foundations tied to Rockefeller and Morgan, began publishing papers arguing that monopolies were natural evolutions of capitalism. In one infamous case, Senator Joseph Foraker of Ohio was revealed to have accepted tens of thousands of dollars in consulting fees from Standard Oil while serving on a committee investigating the company. When the scandal broke, Foraker shrugged it off. If the people do not like the laws that govern industry, they are free to elect new men to make new ones. It was a chilling reminder that the system's power did not end at the courthouse door. It extended into the very heart of democracy itself. By 1912, frustration with the inadequacy of existing antitrust efforts had reached a boiling point. In response, Congress convened a special investigation, the Pujo Committee, to examine the influence of Wall Street bankers on the American economy. What they found was staggering. Testimony revealed that just 18 men, through interlocking directorates and coordinated investment strategies, controlled over 70% of the nation's financial resources. Morgan alone sat on the boards of 48 corporations. His influence extended into railroads, steel, insurance, utilities, and even newspapers. The committee's report concluded, "We find the existence of a money trust, a concentration of control over money and credit so great that it may at any time dictate the financial policy of the United States." The language was stark. And yet, even with such damning findings, the committee lacked the political power to dismantle the network it had exposed. Few prosecutions followed. No major banker faced prison. The machine endured, chastened, perhaps, but unbroken. The aftermath of the Pujo investigation brought one of the most controversial developments in American financial history, the creation of the Federal Reserve System in 1913. Officially, the Federal Reserve was designed to stabilize the banking system, prevent panics, and ensure a steady supply of credit. But critics saw something far darker, a compromise between government and the syndicate, a mechanism that would place the nation's monetary policy under the influence of the very bankers who had manipulated it for decades. The details of the Federal Reserve Act were drafted during a secret meeting on Jekyll Island, off the coast of Georgia, attended by representatives of Morgan, Rockefeller, and Kuhn, Loeb & Co. One participant, Frank Vanderlip, later admitted, if it had been made public that our group had gotten together to write a banking bill, it would have been attacked as a Wall Street conspiracy. Nothing less could have been true. The result was a hybrid system, neither fully public nor fully private. That, critics argued, cemented the financial elite's influence over the U.S. economy for generations. As for the men at the center of it all, their fates varied, but none suffered as their victims had. John D. Rockefeller retired as the richest man in the world, devoting his later years to philanthropy. He died in 1937, his wealth adjusted for inflation exceeding $400 billion, more than any individual in history. J.P. Morgan continued to dominate American finance until his death in 1913, his bank evolving into one of the world's largest financial institutions. Andrew Carnegie sold his steel empire to Morgan for $480 million, an unimaginable sum at the time, and devoted the rest of his life to libraries, education, and global peace initiatives. Cornelius Vanderbilt's descendants remained among America's wealthiest families for generations. None faced prison. None were personally bankrupted. Most died celebrated as captains of industry and benefactors of mankind. Their names adorned universities, museums, hospitals, and foundations. But beneath the marble plaques and philanthropic legacies, the truth remained. They had built their fortunes not on creation, but on domination. The same cannot be said for the millions whose lives were shaped and shattered by the system. Thousands of small businesses were ruined. Entire towns dependent on independent rail lines or refineries were wiped off the map. Workers who once dreamed of building their own enterprises became permanent wage laborers, trapped in a system designed to keep them dependent. Farmers, once the backbone of the American economy, found themselves squeezed between monopolized railroads and manipulated commodity markets. Many lost their land. Some lost their lives. Their stories were rarely told. History remembered the names of the men who built empires, not the millions crushed beneath them. As the decades passed, a concerted effort was made to rewrite the narrative. Textbooks described the Gilded Age as a period of dynamic growth. Newspapers celebrated the entrepreneurial genius of Rockefeller, Morgan, and Carnegie. Philanthropy softened their public image. Even some historians argued that monopolies were an inevitable, even necessary, stage of industrial development. But the documents remained. The memos, the ledgers, the testimonies, they told a different story. They revealed a system not born of necessity but of deliberate design. A system that had reshaped the nation to serve the few at the expense of the many. And though laws had changed and companies had new names, the architecture of that system, concentration of power, manipulation of markets, collusion between government and finance, still stood, invisible yet immense. By the early 20th century, the United States had entered a new era. Progressive reforms, regulatory agencies, labor protections. But the scars of the Gilded Age never fully healed. The system's creators had taught the world a chilling lesson. Control need not come from armies or kings. It could come from credit lines and boardrooms, from contracts and collusion. And once entrenched, such control was almost impossible to dislodge. A century later, their fingerprints remain on every aspect of modern capitalism. In corporate mergers, financial bailouts, lobbying empires, and global banking networks, the names have changed. The tools are more sophisticated. But the machine hums on. When the dust of the Gilded Age finally settled, when the last courtroom battles had been fought, and the final corporate breakups declared, many believed the era of unchecked monopolies had ended. The newspapers spoke of a new dawn for American democracy. Lawmakers assured citizens that the excesses of the past would never return. But history, as it often does, tells a more complicated story. To Rockefeller, and to men like him, wealth was not theft. It was proof of superiority. The suffering of millions was irrelevant next to the smooth functioning of their machine. And the terrifying truth was that much of the public agreed with him. By the end of the investigation, the mountain of evidence was overwhelming. Hundreds of internal memos revealing deliberate price manipulation, dozens of contracts proving collusion between supposedly competing companies, financial ledgers documenting profit from crises the syndicate itself had caused, telegraph records showing coordinated market movements across states. Correspondence with politicians, revealing bribery and policy manipulation. 1. Investigator remarked that the documents read less like the papers of a business and more like the Blueprints of an occupying force, the illusion of free enterprise had been shattered. The invisible hand of the market, so often praised by economists, was revealed to be a clenched fist, and it belonged to a handful of men. The revelations were front-page news for weeks. Public outrage surged. Mass rallies were held in cities across the country, demanding government action. Populist politicians thundered against the robber barons and their money trusts. And yet, even amid the anger, fear lingered. Many Americans were terrified of what would happen if the syndicate were dismantled. What if the markets collapsed? What if the railroads stopped? What if credit dried up? It was a cruel paradox. The same system that had strangled them was now the system they depended on to survive. They have built the walls around us. One labor organizer wrote in 1903, and now we fear what happens if those walls fall. For the first time in American history, the public had seen the gears of the machine turning. They had read the memos, heard the testimony, seen the ledgers. The syndicate's power was no longer invisible, and that visibility was itself a kind of terror. Because the truth was worse than anyone had imagined. It wasn't that the system had escaped the law. It was that it had become the law. The revelations from the Hepburn hearings and the leaked Atlas book sent shockwaves through the nation. Ordinary citizens, long accustomed to viewing tycoons as heroic captains of industry, now saw them for what they were, the architects of a hidden machine that had manipulated markets, politics, and even the government itself. But revelation alone wasn't enough. The next step was action, and the United States government, pressured by angry voters and a rising populist movement, was about to test its strength against the most powerful men in the nation's history. In 1890, years before the full extent of the syndicate's power was known, Congress had passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, a law designed to combat restraint of trade and break up monopolies. For nearly a decade, it had been a dead letter, barely enforced and often ignored. But now, armed with evidence and public outrage, federal prosecutors decided to wield it like a weapon. Their first and most symbolic target, Standard Oil. On November 15, 1906, the U.S. government filed suit against Rockefeller's empire, alleging systematic monopolization, price fixing, and illegal collusion across state lines. The trial that followed, United States versus Standard Oil Commerce of New Jersey, would become one of the most consequential legal battles in American history. The courtroom in St. Louis, Missouri was packed from the first day. Journalists jostled for seats, telegraph operators clattered furiously in the corridors, and the public lined up around the block for a chance to witness the downfall of the world's most powerful corporation. The government's case was staggering in scope. Prosecutors presented over 150 witnesses and 20,000 pages of documents, including many of the memos and contracts uncovered during the Hepburn investigation. The evidence showed, beyond any doubt, that Standard Oil had conspired with railroads to fix shipping rates and deny service to competitors, manipulated prices through predatory undercutting and secret rebates, established front companies to disguise its dominance and mislead regulators, controlled output and supply to manipulate national oil prices. In one explosive moment, a prosecutor read aloud a private letter from Rockefeller to one of his field agents. Do not speak of competition. Speak only of absorption. The weaker must serve the stronger or perish, the courtroom gasped. Newspapers published the quote in bold headlines the next morning, but the defense had its own arsenal. Rockefeller's lawyers, some of the best paid in the country, argued that Standard Oil had increased efficiency, lowered prices for consumers, and expanded the American economy. Breaking up the company, they warned, would destabilize markets and harm the very public the government claimed to protect. It was a shrewd strategy, and one that played on a very real fear: dependency. The same public that despised Standard Oil's power also relied on it. Its kerosene lit their lamps. Its lubricants powered their machines. Its distribution networks supplied towns from Boston to San Francisco. On May 15, 1911, after nearly 5 years of legal warfare, the Supreme Court finally delivered its verdict. Standard Oil was guilty of violating antitrust laws and must be broken up into 34 separate companies. The decision was hailed as a victory for democracy, proof that no man, no matter how rich, was above the law. Newspapers called it the death of monopoly. President William Howard Taft declared that the people have reclaimed their sovereignty. But beneath the celebration lay a grim reality. When the deal was exposed a decade later during a Senate inquiry, Senator George Vest summed it up with chilling clarity. In September 1869, two men, Jay Gould and James Fisk, both protégés of Cornelius Vanderbilt, hatched a plan to seize control of the nation's gold supply. The U.S. Treasury regularly sold gold to stabilize the dollar, but Gould and Fisk knew that if they could corner the market, they could drive prices sky high and profit from the chaos. They began by bribing officials close to President Ulysses S. Grant, including Grant's brother-in-law. Using inside information about Treasury policy, the pair quietly bought up gold, forcing prices from $130 to $160 an ounce. The ripple effects were catastrophic. Businesses dependent on imports and exports collapsed overnight. Farmers were ruined. Banks teetered on the brink. On September 24th, a day that would become known as Black Friday, Grant finally intervened, ordering the Treasury to release $4 million in gold. Prices plummeted, wiping out fortunes in minutes. But Gould and Fisk had already sold their positions at the peak, walking away with millions. The House Committee investigation later concluded, this was not speculation. It was manipulation of a scale unprecedented in our history, and it was executed with precision, malice, and impunity. And yet neither man faced criminal charges. The system protected its architects. By 1895, the U.S. Treasury itself was faltering. A run on gold reserves, sparked by foreign investors withdrawing their holdings, threatened to bankrupt the federal government. Panic loomed. But in the midst of the crisis, one man stepped forward with an offer. J.P. Morgan proposed a private deal. He and a consortium of European bankers would loan the U.S. Treasury $65 million in gold in exchange for government bonds sold at a deep discount. Desperate and out of options, President Grover Cleveland agreed. The deal restored confidence and made Morgan and his associates a fortune. But more importantly, it set a precedent. From that moment on, the American government itself could be bent to the will of private finance. Senator William Peffer remarked bitterly during the inquiry, "We have surrendered the sovereignty of the United States, not to a foreign power, but to a syndicate of bankers. And we have done so without a single shot being fired." It was not a coup in the traditional sense, but it was something far more insidious, a demonstration that the line between public authority and private wealth was now blurred beyond recognition. Each of these incidents, each act of calculated sabotage and systemic manipulation should have sparked outrage. And in some quarters it did. Farmers' alliances and labor unions condemned moneyed tyranny. A handful of newspapers decried the plutocratic cabal, but most Americans rationalized it away. Panic was the price of progress. Consolidation was the path to efficiency. Private intervention was necessary to preserve stability. The language of the system had seeped into the national psyche. Even ordinary citizens began to parrot the justifications of their oppressors. As one factory worker told a reporter during the 1893 crisis, "Yes, they ruin us sometimes, but they also keep the wheels turning. Without them, there is no America." That was the final victory of the syndicate. Not wealth, not power, but belief. The belief that their domination was inevitable, natural, even necessary. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button. It really helps us keep uncovering the hidden machinery of history. And share this video with someone who loves dark mysteries and forgotten truths, because what happens next will change the way you see money forever. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button. It really helps us keep uncovering the hidden machinery of history. And share this video with someone who loves dark mysteries and forgotten truths, because what happens next will change the way you see money forever. For decades, the system thrived in shadows. It was a whisper behind closed doors, a ledger hidden in a locked drawer, a conversation cut short when strangers entered the room. But by the late 1890s, the weight of secrecy had grown too heavy to contain, and cracks, faint at first, began to appear. February 12, 1898, Cleveland, Ohio. In a quiet office above a cobbler's shop, Franklin R. Chase, a mid-level attorney for Standard Oil, sealed a letter that would alter American history. It was addressed to Henry Lloyd, a muckraking journalist known for his relentless attacks on monopoly power. Inside were 42 pages of internal memos, contracts, and correspondences, documents Chase had stolen from Standard Oil's legal department after a bitter dispute with management. He claimed he wanted to clear his conscience. Whether that was true or not, the evidence he delivered was explosive. One memo, dated September 9, 1888, revealed Standard Oil's internal pricing model, a system designed explicitly to bankrupt competitors by undercutting prices below cost in regions where rivals operated, then hiking them again once control was secured. Another letter, signed by John D. Rockefeller himself, ordered agents to establish dummy corporations in Pennsylvania and Ohio to conceal Standard's growing market share. The appearance of competition must be preserved, Rockefeller wrote. The public must never see the hand that guides the market. It was the first documented proof that competition was nothing more than theater, and that the trust's reach extended far beyond what regulators had ever suspected. The documents caused a sensation. Newspapers across the country ran front-page exposés. Outraged by the revelations, Congress convened a special investigative committee under Representative William P. Hepburn in 1899 to examine the growing power of monopolies. The hearings, held in a packed chamber of the Capitol building, became one of the most dramatic spectacles of the Gilded Age. Day after day, witnesses took the stand. Former employees, ruined competitors, railroad executives, all painted a picture of a system that was not just unethical, but almost mathematically engineered. One of the most damning testimonies came from Charles Pratt, a former independent refiner bought out by Standard Oil under duress. "They offered me 30 cents on the dollar," Pratt recalled. "When I refused, my shipping costs tripled overnight. Railroads that had served me for a decade suddenly claimed no capacity. Within a month, I couldn't move a single barrel of oil. I had no choice but to sell." Another witness, Milton G. Hamilton, revealed how banks tied to J.P. Morgan would cut off credit lines to companies that refused to sell to the trusts. It was a blockade, not with soldiers, but with dollars. They could starve any business without ever breaking a law. The committee uncovered contracts showing how Morgan's banking syndicate had orchestrated artificial shortages of steel and coal to manipulate prices. They discovered that railroads and refineries often shared board members, allowing the same handful of men to set freight rates and supply prices simultaneously. And perhaps most chilling of all, they revealed a coordinated communication network, a web of telegraph codes and private couriers used by the syndicate to share inside information and coordinate strategy in real time. It was, as Hepburn himself said, a conspiracy, not of gunmen or thieves, but of financiers and lawyers, and it threatens the Republic more than any army could. If the Hepburn hearings had been a spark, the next revelation was a bombshell. In 1901, a disgruntled clerk at J.P. Morgan & Co. leaked excerpts from a secret ledger known internally as the Atlas Book. The ledger documented over 200 covert transactions between Morgan's bank, railroad companies, and industrial trusts, transactions designed to manipulate stock prices, crush rivals, and even influence government policy. One entry, dated January 3, 1895, described the infamous Treasury bailout, secured bond issue at 104.12, immediate resale at 118, profit $3.8 million. Executive branch fully compliant. Another, dated May 11, 1897, recorded a covert payment to a senator on the Interstate Commerce Committee to delay a bill targeting freight rate collusion. The Atlas Book proved something the public had long suspected but could never prove. The system wasn't an abstract conspiracy. It was written down, calculated, and accounted for. The discoveries sent shockwaves through Washington. Attorney General John Griggs described the evidence as a corporate government operating within our own. Newspapers dubbed it the invisible empire of capital. Private investigators working for the Department of Justice reported that entire industries were effectively controlled by less than 40 men. Even the Supreme Court appeared compromised. 2 justices were revealed to have held substantial stock in companies under investigation. A Treasury Department agent named James W. Witherspoon summarized the horror in a private letter to a colleague. "What we have uncovered is not a cartel. It is a state within a state, a sovereign machine whose power exceeds that of the Constitution. And the people, God help them, have no idea. The climax of the investigation came on June 5, 1902, when John D. Rockefeller himself was subpoenaed to testify before a federal grand jury. The oil magnate, famously reclusive, arrived under heavy guard and sat silently for most of the proceedings. When he finally spoke, his words were chilling. "I have done nothing but pursue efficiency. If others failed, it is because they were weak. If the market bent to my will, it is because my will was stronger. That is not a crime. It is nature." The courtroom fell silent.